As I said last week, we are starting our first sermon series ever at Transforming Life Christian Church in the book of Matthew. And even though Matthew wasn't the first book of the New Testament written, it's the first book in the New Testament. So if as Christians we open up the New Testament, that's what we see first. And so I'm calling this series God's First Words to Christians, at least in the majority of us. Again, when they wrote the book, some of the books were earlier, but for most of these 2,000 years since, Matthew's the first book that we're aware of. And so it just struck me, God must have had some things there that he wanted us to know that are just foundational to living life as Christians. And I think we started to see that even last week. We saw in the life of Joseph and everything that led up to it, that God has a plan and we have a part. And it was true for Joseph of the greatest plan of sending Jesus, but it's true for every one of us. God has things he wants us to do, and he's been working and arranging, but we all have a part. And sometimes to do our part, we need to trust in his control and love because it's a little scary. Well, today we're going to follow that up, and it just, as I looked at this, it's like, okay, we have a part, and God begins to show us, here's what your part includes. And today, we're going to talk about worship. And when I say that, what comes to mind? You know, here's a sermon on worship, we are probably going to hear about what? Praising God. Music. You think any other thoughts? It's a sermon on worship. What are we going to hear about?
How to go about it.
How to go about it. That'd be a good one. About prayer. You know, what about, we talk about hopefully the sermon is a part of worship. Maybe, our mind might go to a lot of things on the Sunday morning. Oh, here's things we do. Let's see how we're supposed to do them or whatever. The other thing in this passage, and you might be familiar with Matthew chapter 2 is where we're at if you haven't seen it at the top of the outline yet. But this passage is going to talk about two groups of people. And put aside what you know about it. If all you knew is here's a sermon on worshiping God. And there's two groups of people. One is this group of astronomers / astrologers. They were a little bit of both from the area of Persia and Babylon. And the other group of people are the religious leaders of Israel. If you hadn't ever read this before, here's a sermon on worshiping God, which group do you think would be the focus?
Israel.
Yeah, the religious leaders of Israel. Well, let's read the first part of Matthew chapter 2 and see what we find. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. And as soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go and worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So here's a passage, the first part, these 12 verses, and the word worship occurs 3 times. So it's pretty clear that's a big focus. But did we see a lot of those things that we were thinking of? Did anyone sing a song? Did anyone even say a prayer? Preach a sermon? Praise God, probably working there a little bit. And between these two groups, again, the Jewish religious leaders and these foreign astrologers, which group's the focus? Yeah, the Magi are clearly the focus. And so as I was preparing this sermon, I thought, those are what we expected to be the focus, but when we talk about worship, but they weren't. And so it reminded me of a line from one of the classic movies of all time, The Princess Bride, If you're not familiar with that, don't leave now, but you might want to skip lunch and watch that movie because it's that good. But there's the scene where, Vicini has been, people have asked him questions. What if this happens? What if this happens? And he says, inconceivable. No way it could happen. Well, they all keep happening. And so finally, Inigo Montoya stops him and says, you keep using this word. Maybe it doesn't mean what you think it means. And I thought about that for us. We use the word worship all the time, but here's a passage on worship that didn't have hardly anything we expected. Maybe that word doesn't mean what we think it means. What does the word worship mean? Every sermon has a central question and, something that we want to ask. And we might not answer it by the end of the sermon, but at least we start asking it and God shows it to us. And so today the central question is, how much do I worship God? How much do I worship God? But in light of what we've just seen, first we need to realize, what's it mean to worship God? What is worship? What's it include? And so that's really what we're going to do a lot of today. In order to answer that question, we need to look at worship. And so let's look at these verses again because they reveal a lot about what worship is. Verse 1, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now those Magi, we don't know a lot more than I said at first. They're astrologers / astronomers, so a little bit of science, but also a little bit of mysticism. And they're from the area of Persia / Babylon. We're not exactly sure, and those blended together in the ancient world somewhat. We don't know a lot about them, and we don't know specifically how did they know about the star and what it represented. One possibility is that Daniel, you remember Daniel and the lions, when they were taken from Judah by King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Daniel was part of a group of advisors and counselors, and this may be either that group or an offshoot of it. And so they knew because of Daniel. Another explanation of how they knew about things is maybe God told them in a dream. He's going to talk to them in a dream later, and so maybe he did that. We don't know. What we do know is what we see. They somehow knew this star represented something special, the birth of the King of the Jews, and look what it says. We have come to worship him. And it's one of those little things that, again, you read over real quick and you don't even think about, but stop and think, coming to worship him, I can see how maybe this group of outsiders would say, we've come to see him. Because wouldn't it be pretty cool? I mean, here's a star. It represents, I want to see the child that gets his own star. I mean, that's pretty cool. I'm curious. I'm interested. But where's the focus with that? If they said, we want to see him, where's the focus? Yeah, it's on them. You might say, well, they want to see him. Yeah, but they want to see him because they're interested, because they're curious, they're amazed. The word worship puts the focus on Jesus. We've come not just to see him, we've come to worship him. We've come to focus on him and through him on God. Well, you read on. It says in verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And I read that, and I thought, well, the Magi hear about this star, however they learn about it, and their reaction is, let's go worship him. Herod hears about all this, and his reaction, he's disturbed. He wants to kill him. All Jerusalem's disturbed. And the thing is, we know some things about Herod. It's not in the Bible, but we know from history. Herod was half Jewish, and so the Romans thought, he'll be a good person to be the king over this land. Not the ultimate authority, but sort of the highest Jewish-ish authority over Palestine, over Israel at that time. But he was not at all committed to God. He was far more committed to himself and keeping his power. So much so that any time there was a threat to his power, he dealt treacherously with it, including killing his own sons at times. Killed some of his own relatives and sons when he thought they are threatening my power. And so here you have it, these people, hey, we're coming to see the new king of the Jews. That was Herod's title. So he's disturbed, and all Jerusalem's disturbed. Why? Well, because who knows what Herod's going to do. And I thought about that. And if you put yourself first, then Jesus' claim to be first is going to disturb you. You're not going to like that. I'm first, and here's Jesus saying he should be first. No. Now, we might not be as extreme as Herod, but we're going to see it's one side or the other, however extreme you are. And it's definitely going to prevent you from worshiping. If you insist on being first, it's going to prevent you from worshiping. Move on there, verse 4, he says, when he had called together, so Herod had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, I looked at that, and Herod knew right away who to ask. You know, the Jewish religious leaders, they knew these Old Testament scriptures inside and out. So he asked them, and right away, they know the answer. You know, they'll say, well, we're going to have to look at that, Herod. We'll do some study. We'll get back to you. No, they're just like, well, Bethlehem, of course. They knew the answer. And so what struck me, though, is in every passage, and especially stories, you probably heard me say, look for a wait a minute moment. You know, something that you're reading and you're like, wait a minute. If this, then why this? Or why didn't this? And this was the moment for me. Here you have these Jewish religious leaders. And the central focus of Judaism for hundreds, even thousands of years has been the coming of the Messiah. And these magi come to town, and notice it says everyone was disturbed. It wasn't like people didn't know. They knew the magi come to town. Why? Because there's a star, and we've come to worship the King of the Jews. And they knew exactly where he used to be born, and they do nothing. These religious leaders don't do a thing. Now, I thought about, well, you know, maybe they made a big deal. Herod wouldn't be too happy with them. Yeah, but they don't do anything. And maybe the chief priests couldn't go, but you think he'd send someone. Find out about it. We've been waiting for this. The Messiah. He's the focus of everything. Like, nope. Yeah, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Okay, next. Where are you guys going for lunch? What are we doing? Yeah. That just doesn't make sense. So that was the wait a minute moment. Like, how can you do nothing? And it tells us something about worship, or the opposite of worship, as we're going to see. Well, verse 7, then Herod called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go and worship him. Well, I thought about that. Why did he call them secretly? And, you know, who's it a secret from? There's only a couple of groups. I mean, maybe the people in general, probably the religious leaders. He doesn't want to know, them to know he's researching it, because they probably know he's not really planning on worshiping the child. The Magi, maybe they don't know about Herod's reputation, but the Jewish leaders knew it. Herod's not going to worship. So he calls them secretly, and whatever his thought was, I see this plan. Here's Herod. He's scheming. He's devising this plan to kill the child. And ultimately, if he's trying to kill the child, he's devising a plan against God. Yeah. So here's Herod, and whatever he thinks about God, we don't know, but he certainly knows this whole religious history and everything leading up, and like, I'm going to stop it. I am setting myself against God and the whole Jewish religious expectation. Well, let's see how that works out. Verse 9, after the Magi had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, and realize here, because this is always in the Nativity, you got the shepherds and the Magi. They were here about 2 years later. Jesus was not still in the manger, in the stable. They're in a house at this point, so a little different than we see there. They saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Verse 13, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So we saw the king's plan, and we see God's power. Not a lot of drama there, is there? Like, I wonder who's going to win. I don't know if any of you saw the football game Thursday night. It got to 56-0 at one point. It's like, there's not a lot of drama there of who's going to win. And even wilder than that, the game was in Atlanta, and they showed Georgia Tech Stadium a little ways away. And apparently that was the site of the most lopsided college game in history. Georgia Tech played Cumberland. I've never heard of Cumberland, and maybe they never played again. The score was 222-0. That's almost 56 points a quarter. 222-0. Yeah, can you imagine? I wonder who's going to win this one. Well, you look here. Herod, the king of the Jews, has this plan to oppose God. And like, he doesn't stand a chance. Cumberland had more of a chance to come back in the last minute. It's not going to work, and it didn't work. Not against God's power. But here's the thing to see. God's power does not negate problems or people doing evil, and we see this next. It says, when Herod, verse 16, realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, let alone God, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. So let's stop there in the passage. And again, this is a sermon on worship, but I'm guessing it's maybe not what we expect. I mean, where are all those worship things that we do? They're not really doing a lot of them. And so it makes me think maybe we expect the wrong things when we think about worship. Maybe we don't know what worship is. And even more than the wrong things, what this passage is focusing on is what it takes for those things, those actions, to truly be worship. This is focusing on some of the foundations that has to be present. If you were at the First Life Group meeting, I mentioned the word worship. Used to be pronounced worthship. You know, Old English, the word worship was pronounced worthship. And that gives you an idea of what the word means. It means to declare the worth of. And I said that's a basic definition. Worship is to act in ways that declare God's ultimate worth in our lives. That's what worship is. And so as we look at this passage, it doesn't so much say the specific things, but it tells us three underlying traits. That for the things you do to truly be worship, you've got to have these present. And the first one is a focus on God versus a focus on yourself. A focus on God versus yourself. And we see this with the Magi. Again, they didn't say we've come to see him because we're curious, but we've come to worship him. It's all about him. And then sometimes in this passage you see a negative example. It's like people who are not worshiping, not declaring God's worth. And you certainly see that with the Jewish leaders. You know, once again, here's the Messiah they've been waiting for. And what do? We'll get to him later. They're far more focused on themselves than they are on the news they've been waiting for thousands of years. You know, and I sort of got the idea, it's like, well, you know, when he gets old enough to really be significant, you know, and play into things that are important to us, then we'll check him out. Oh, but definitely, worship starts with a focus on God versus ourselves. The second thing about worship is worship involves putting God first versus putting yourself first. Once again, the Magi, think about what they were doing. We don't even know what their commitment was to God to start. But they took this trip, and from what they tell Herod, they first saw the star 2 years prior. Now, I'm sure it took a while to arrange a trip like this, but still, you're talking about probably a year and a half of travel. Can you imagine that back then? That's just to get where you're going. A year and a half. And then you know what? You've got to get back. 3 years of your life. And look how long they were there. Not very. I mean, we complain, you know, if you had to fly across country and you were only there for a little bit and it flew back, we'd say, what a day. I had to fly all day and I was there for an hour. 3 years of a trip. They were there a few days. But they're like, it's totally worth it. It's totally worth it. We're worshiping God. They put God first. And then you see the opposite, again, the Jewish leaders and certainly Herod. Now, no way is Herod putting anyone before himself. It's all about him and holding on to his power. And so you see the opposites. Worship is putting God first. And then the last thing, and I think maybe the most tangible aspect and trait of worship, is to rely on God versus relying on yourself. And this, again, we see a negative example from Herod. Here he is, the ultimate of relying on himself versus God. He's not only just relying on himself versus God, he's opposing God. Now, you don't have to go that far. You don't, obviously, if you're going to oppose God, you're saying, God, help me oppose you. You can't really do that. but just things in general, things in life. How often do we do things, and maybe neutral and maybe even good things for God? You know, that song, The Heart of Worship, it came because a worship leader realized we're doing all these things to focus on God, but the things we're doing really focus on us instead of God. Wow, we need to fix that. And that's where that song came about. And I look and I think sometimes we do things. God, I'm doing this for you, but we do it in ways that are far more focused on us than on God. They rely. If it's going to succeed, it's because of us far more than God. And so we really rely on us, not God. And that's the opposite of worship. Maybe we don't even realize it. And so you look at these things here. Again, a focus on God versus ourself, putting God first versus ourself, and relying on God versus ourself. Those are the traits that are essential for worship. And so as we ask this central question, how much do I worship God? Should we be looking at what we do on Sunday mornings or what we do on Monday through Saturday? Or Sunday afternoon through Saturday? Yeah, I think sometimes, how much do I worship God? Well, I show up most Sundays. Yeah, I'm there most of the time. This passage says it's not about that. What do you do during the rest of the week? How do you treat God? Do you put him first? Do you focus on him? Do you rely on him? That's the key to answering this question, how much do I worship him? Because I thought, look at the perfect example of not doing it. These Jewish leaders, no one worshiped God, quote unquote, more than they did. All the actions, matter of fact, they didn't just do it one day a week. They worshiped God every week. They did sacrifices. That was part of their worship. Prayers, incense, all those things they did every single day. But we look here, were they the ones who were worshiping God? Declaring his worth? Not at all. You know, it reminded me, I'm going through Genesis to try to stay ahead for the life groups. And you got these two chapters, and again, you don't really notice the significance of the one until you read the other and you compare and contrast them. Abraham is called by God in Genesis 12. You know, and it's pretty amazing. God says, I want you to leave this land, go where I'll show you. I'm not going to tell you yet. And he does. What a step of faith. And he gets to Canaan, the eventual promised land. And it says he built an altar in one place. He called on the name of the Lord, which is their expression for worship. So their worship was different than ours, even a little different than the Jewish people of Jesus' day. But that's what he did. He worshiped God, and then he moved somewhere else, and he worshiped God again. He went through those actions of worshiping. Well, then, at the middle of chapter 12, he's faced with this difficult situation, the famine. And this question of who does he rely on? Himself and what he can see down in Egypt, or God? And he chooses Egypt, not God. And it leads to all kinds of problems. Well, then you get chapter 13. He's come back. God says that was a bad idea, Abraham. He's back in the land, and he builds another altar. He calls on the name of the Lord twice again, exactly like the beginning of chapter 12. And in chapter 13, he's faced with another situation, a difficult situation. You know, the land where he's at, the one area can't sustain his animals and herds and lots. And so instead of Abraham saying, hey, I'm the one in charge, God called me, you go wherever, and I'm taking the good land, he gives Lot the choice, and Lot takes the good land. He relied on God providing, even though what he could see said, I should really be taking this good land. And so I saw that contrast. Both times he went through the acts of worshiping God, but when he was really tested, who do you think is worthy of trusting? At first he trusted himself. The second time he got it right and he trusted God. And it just brought to mind, it's not the worship things we do in and of themselves. It's, do I live a life that shows that God has the ultimate worth? That he is first, that my focus is on him, that I rely on him. You know, how much or whether we worship is determined by whether we show his worth or not the actions we do on a Sunday morning. And so as we try to answer this question, the immediate and obvious obstacle to worship is just realizing, well, okay, I thought I was. You would have asked me how much I worship. Well, I would have put down this much. But now I'm like, I'm not so sure. So that's the first obstacle, and sometimes that's the case. We just got to get it straight. But in any good story, there's always a root problem. There's something that's a little deeper than just waking up and saying, okay, didn't know that, now I know, move on. There's some problem that, like, that one I'm aware of, and it's tougher to face, and it's definitely here. You look at Herod and the Jewish leaders. Maybe they didn't know exactly what worship was, but down below that, there's a deeper problem. They didn't want to put God first, did they? Yeah, it wasn't like, oh, we didn't realize that we weren't putting God first. Herod was pretty clear. He wasn't putting God. He didn't want to. And again, we may say, well, he's such an extreme, but we need to look at ourselves and say, when I'm really faced with putting God first or me first, do I want to put God first? Of course, I want to say I do, and we're here in church, and so we should all, of course I do. And do we really want to? It's tough sometimes. Especially that last aspect, and that's why I say it's the most tangible. When it comes to a difficult situation, who do I rely on? Do I rely on God, or do I rely on me and what I can see? When I'm in some of those situations, and again, what are they? Well, I thought about it, just guidelines for life. Do I trust, and again, worship, God is worthy. Do I say God is worthy of me following his principles for living? When I'm faced with a situation at or work maybe, and do I lie? Do I be deceitful and so I see it sort of will turn out this way that looks pretty good, or do I stand up and be honest, have integrity, and boy, that could get me into trouble. You sure your principles are really worth it, God? You sure you know what you're talking about? Or others, again, when someone has done something to us and God's principles say forgive them, and my thought says no, get revenge, or at least hold it over them. That's what really is going to be better for me in life. Or God providing for us. Again, he's given principles. And I said, we're not going to take up an offering, but boy, the subject of giving comes up often because it's so linked not just to giving and obedience, it's linked to faith. And quite honestly, if you're to look at it through the eyes of sight, what is better for you materially and financially? Well, it's to keep that 10%. I mean, that's just pure math, isn't it? I give it away, I have less. But you trust God, you live by the fact that his principles are worthy of following. And I'm not guaranteeing you that you give 10% to God and he's going to bless you with 20, 30, or 40. There is not a promise like that, just exactly. Now, he is going to bless you in ways that go far, that are abundant, more than you can imagine. And I don't know what that'll look like. But I do know this is one of the most tangible areas of life, is to trust God with our finances and realize I'll be better off in some way. Same way with fulfillment. Again, you think about what is it that's going to bring me satisfaction and fulfillment in life? And boy, it sure looks like this, like following this career, like putting in extra hours, maybe putting my family to the side and getting that promotion that, and doing what it, and none of that stuff's inherently wrong, spending some time, working hard. But if we put it before God, if we say, God, what I can see is worth more than your principles that say, no, fulfillment's going to come as I minister to people and as I put you first and my job down the line. These are the day-to-day things that we need to think about as we talk about worship. And they're tough. They're tough. We really do have to stop and think about them. And as I looked at this, again, we all struggle with it. How do we overcome it? When we are faced with something and it looks like I'm not going to be better off if I follow you, God, if I declare your principles are worth it and live by them, how do we do it anyway? And it goes back to this idea of trusting God. It goes back to, again, how do I grow in this area? Well, how do we grow in any area? Remember, the foundation, there's three principles, three elements of growth. At the foundation, and I use a triangle. At the bottom, the base, the foundation is God's Word. You got to know the principles. You got to know what the Bible says. But then the other two arms build on that, and the one is relationships with other Christians because it's tough and I need encouragement. And so I need to be together. And if I don't need it today, they need it today, and I need to be encouraging them. So that's the one arm. But the other arm of the triangle, if that's what you would call such things, the arms or legs, I don't know. But the other one that builds upon the principles of God's Word are situations. We read in God's Word that, okay, we should put God first. We should rely on Him. All those things we should do, and we say, yes, I'll do it. God puts us in a situation, doesn't He? He's like, for that to be real, you've got to live it out. And it's not God mad at us like, I'll show you. Yeah, see, no, it's like, I want it to be real to you. I don't want you just to know it in your head. I want you to experience it. So I've got to put you in that situation, and it's not going to be easy. And so the key to those situations is to trust God. Trust He's in control. And trust He loves us. And those two things keep coming up over and over. People say, like, Steve, that's all you talk about. Well, they are the key. When you're in whatever situation, if we trust God's in control and He loves us, and it strikes me over and over, rarely does the Bible just come out and say, trust God's control and His love, but it shows us God's in control and He loves us, and this passage does it again. There's one more thing I want to point out about this passage, because it's one of those themes. When you see something repeat itself, take notice. And there's 3 times that the Bible talks about fulfilled prophecies, or that this passage does. Verse 14 says, "So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod, and so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" You realize what a prophecy is. It means hundreds of years before something happened, God told a prophet, and the prophet told the people, this is going to happen. And it just always strikes me, I can't tell you what's going to happen this afternoon with any certainty, but God, absolute certainty, one fulfilled. Verse 17, "Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled," about the babies being killed. And then the last one, the verses we hadn't read all the way yet, verse 19, "After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, 'Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead.' So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod," so there was a son he hadn't killed, "he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee and went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." So 3 prophecies fulfilled. See how that shows God's control? God said hundreds or thousands of years before, this is going to happen, and it happened. Doesn't that help us when we're facing, like, God, you sure you got this? And God's like, yeah, I think I can handle it. I'm pretty good at this stuff of knowing what's coming. And so the prophecies show God's control, and the reason for all of this shows God's love. What's the reason? Sending his son dying for us, restoring the relationship. Why? Because God loves us. For God so loved the world that he gave his son. And so I look at this, and again, when I am faced with that choice, do I rely on God and show he's worth it? Yeah, I can, because I can trust he's in control and he loves me. All right, last thing. What do I need to do? How do I take this so it's not just a history lesson and put it in practice in my life? And one thing that struck me as I thought about this, remember when in the life group a couple weeks ago, we said there's a twofold purpose. You know, as Christians, we've got 2 purposes in life, and the one stems from just being created by God, and that was to worship him. Well, here we are in Matthew 2. Matthew 1 said, God has a plan and you have a part, and our first thing that we need to do in our part of God's plan is to worship. And so we see this key thing. And so what do I need to do? First of all, realize what worship truly is. Realize what it truly is. And I thought about that. Maybe the better thing is begin to realize what it truly is, because we won't know. It's one of those subjects that we can sit here and say, okay, I'm going to worship you, God, this whole week, whatever it is. And there's no way you could know what it's going to be on Tuesday afternoon, what it's going to be on Thursday morning. But when you're there, now you start to apply this and like, okay, I'm in this situation. If I truly want to show that God has ultimate worth, I'm going to do this. Well, I never would have thought it applies to this situation. But begin to open yourself up. Second, in light of that, ask, how much do I worship God? Now ask that question. How much do I worship God? And realize we're either worshiping God or we're not. You know another thing about this passage that hit me? At the beginning, who's trying to kill Jesus? Herod. He doesn't. The Jewish leaders, they're not all that devoted to God, but they're not hostile. But who ends up killing Jesus? Those exact same people are who killed Jesus. And so you thought about it. If you're not worshiping God, I'm not saying you're ultimately going to try to kill God, but you're on one side or the other. You're either feeding the side of you that is committed to God and his worth in your life, or you're feeding the side that says, I come first and what I want. And maybe you'll never get that extreme, but we need to realize it's not a small deal. If I am focused on me, I'm not focused on God. In light of that, how much do I worship God? And then last thing always, how do I need to trust his control and love? Be thinking, how do I apply that in these situations that are going to come up this week? And what will it look like? I always like to ask, what will it look like? Well, think about it. God's original purpose for our lives was to worship him. That was his plan. And we've messed it up. And everything you can look at in life that's not the way it should be, doesn't it stem from putting us first and not God? And I'm not saying we're going to exactly change the entire world. Like there'll be no negative news if us here, we just get this. But won't it impact the world if we live by the principle God put in place from the very beginning? God, I'm going to live in a way that puts you first. And just do that more and more. Well, each week, what I want to do is just have a little discussion at the end. And as time moves on, I think, we'll break up into groups and do different things. But I want to follow up. Today, I just thought I'd throw this out, and we won't spend long on it. But the thought that came to my mind, and get some feedback, we just talked about worship. And if I talk to most people, I think if I were to ask, what's more important, worship or obedience? I think before this sermon, I know what the answer was. So the question on the starter is, which is more important, to worship God or obey God? But then the other thing, so, don't just answer the question, why? Which is more important, to worship God or to obey God, and why?